Welcome to the lecture for Research Methods. We'll be talking today about qualitative research. So what is qualitative research? What are its characteristics? Typically it's non-experimental in nature. So you're not going to be typically manipulating an independent variable and measuring a dependent variable. But it typically is research where you're seeking to answer a question. Usually there's some particular question you have in mind, and typically it's an applied question. It's not. It could be used for basic science, but more often there's some sort of real-world problem or phenomenon or incident that you're wanting to learn more about in terms of what's going on and why is it happening this way. It tends to be more exploratory rather than confirmatory. So if there's some phenomenon and you say, well, I think this is what's going on, this happens, then this, and this is kind of the cause and effect, and these are all the people that are involved. If you already have a good idea of what you think is happening, then you should probably use a quantitative approach to confirm your suspicions or confirm your theory. Qualitative is more when you're either unsure of what's happening or you're open to the idea that previously given explanations may not fully explain what's going on. Along those lines, you're more likely to be using open-ended rather than closed-ended questions, right? So the whole approach is, again, not is this what's going on, it's what's going on. How is this happening? It tends to be a fairly flexible approach to doing research, especially when compared to quantitative. When you have, in quantitative research, we have quite a few rules in terms of how things need to be done, and it's fairly standardized. Qualitative is a bit more flexible and designed to be that way. One aspect involved with that is that the data that you're getting, so participant responses, may affect how and which questions are asked next. So you start doing research, and maybe you start with some focus groups, and you learn some information, and that's not the end of your project. You say, okay, well, gee, from these groups I learned this. I think this may be what's going on. Now I'm going to do some interviews with these other folks, right? And this is all still one project. And you didn't decide to do those interviews with those folks and ask whatever questions you're going to ask until you had that first bit of data from the first step. Okay? And also, due to the flexibility of qualitative research, one kind of advantage is you're often able to get a depth of data that is harder to get in quantitative research. Right, so if I'm looking to find out about somebody's experience of depression, and I'm doing a quantitative study, I can ask lots and lots of questions about how depressed they are, but typically they're going to need to be, on a scale of 1 to 7, to what degree do you cry in the mornings? On a scale of 1 to 7, to what degree do you experience guilty thoughts? On a scale of 1 to 7, right? And so I can ask all these different things, but I can only ask so many things. It's a finite list. And if I'm interested in all kinds of different aspects of the experience of depression, I have to kind of know what I think is happening and look to confirm it. Whereas with qualitative, I can say, tell me about your experience of depression. And they may say things that I wouldn't have anticipated, I wouldn't have asked about in a quantitative study. And once they say these new surprising things, I can then ask further about that, going deeper into the concept, into the construct. So that's one of the advantages of the flexibility of qualitative research. And obviously the data in qualitative research aren't immediately quantifiable, i.e. they're qualitative. That's really what makes it qualitative research. And you can, with most types of research, you can turn things into numbers. You can make things eventually quantifiable, but the raw data in a qualitative study, you can't simply add them up, divide them, get an average, and summarize them with our kind of inferential statistics that we typically associate with quantitative research. Okay. Where do these qualitative data come from? A variety of sources. They can probably be grouped into four basic categories. Interviews being one, and these can be individual interviews, or they could be collective. So I'm interviewing one person, or I'm interviewing a couple, or maybe even a family. Right? Slightly different than that would be using focus groups. So still kind of an interview format, but this obviously is going to be always more than one person. And the focus group usually has there's a set agenda. You're looking to find out a certain bit of information from this group that they somehow some expertise on based on their training experiences. Perhaps they're survivors of a natural disaster, and you're going to ask about that. Um, and But a lot of overlap there with collective interviews. Observation being another big one. And this can go from completely unstructured to fairly structured, right? So you want to I'm just going to observe stuff and write down what I see. Or you go in with some coding guidelines. I'm going to look for these categories of things, right? So it can vary with how structured it is, which same with the interviews. The interviews can be completely unstructured. So you're just going to go in and, hey, how are you doing? And then depending on what they say, that tells you what your next question is. Or you may have a list of questions you make sure you want to hit. Right? And then observation is often participant observation, right? Which is really unique to qualitative research. You don't see that in quantitative research. So if you're interested in what goes on at AA meetings, you would go and participate in an AA meeting as somebody in the program, right? Hi, my name is, that kind of thing. With obviously some potential ethical concerns about participant observation and also concerns about impacting the data, which we'll talk about later. There's also non-participant observation, where you're being kind of as unobtrusive as possible, or perhaps just being accepted as an observer, but you're not going to be interacting with people while observing them. And then the fourth kind of big category would be review of documents and materials. This could be journals and diaries, or it could be any type of media, print, video, audio. You want to do qualitative research looking at how views of women toward women as expressed in music changed from the 70s to the 90s. You listen to a bunch of records, or I guess MP3s for you younger folk. But any type of thing that would be kind of archival data could be a source of qualitative data. Two common qualitative methodologies we'll talk about here. There are several. I'll show you this in a minute. But first, we want to hit kind of probably two of the most common approaches, and two that sometimes are confused with each other. One of which being grounded theory method, or grounded theory analysis, sometimes just called grounded theory. And this is an approach. It's a way of discovering theory by reasoning from the data. So it's kind of backward from our typical scientific approach. Like with quantitative research, what we often do is we have some theory, right? And from that theory, we derive a hypothesis. So we kind of have, okay, we think this is what's going to happen. Now let's go collect some data to see if we're right. And if we're right, we supported the theory. If we're wrong, we failed to support the theory. Now we need to revise the theory. This is going the other way. We start at the ground level, right? So we just gather data that, again, we're choosing what data to gather, but we're choosing some data that we think is of interest to a question. And then we're doing stuff with that data to build it up from the ground up toward a theory, trying to make sense of all this data via kind of inductive, maybe even some deductive, but primarily inductive reasoning to build up from the ground to a theory. Something that's interesting about this approach is it involves the simultaneous collection and analysis of data. Because you start kind of wondering about connections among pieces of data immediately, right? You're taking notes during an observation, or you're looking at a transcript of an interview and you're kind of highlighting stuff. As you're doing that, you're trying to think, okay, I kind of get an idea what's going on here. And to some degree, what data you go after next can change based on the first bits of data you look at. And in fact, there's a term for that in the field of qualitative research called theoretical sampling. And this isn't necessarily about always just about sampling people, but sampling data, which is to say that you choose what data to sample as the theory is forming. So again, that kind of idea of maybe I do some focus groups and then I realize I need to talk. I did some focus groups with some firefighters because I was interested in first responders' reactions to a tragic event. And after that, I realized, oh, geez, you know who I need to talk to? I need to talk, based on what they said, I need to go talk to the EMTs. So I'm going to go do individual interviews with EMTs, or maybe focus groups with EMTs. So it could be that. It could be in the course of interviewing somebody, they're telling me about their experiences, and I was, you know, what would be really good if I had if I had them journal their dreams, because a lot of them keep mentioning dreams and nightmares. I'm going to ask them to give me those data if they are willing to. So the questions you ask, the data you sample, are influenced by the theory you're forming as you're going through the process. Okay. And also, because you're doing this kind of data collection, data analysis at the same time, this kind of iterative process, there's this idea of theoretical saturation. And that's the idea that you keep collecting and coding data until you believe that continuing to do so would no longer lead to new insights. So, with quantitative research, we often say, okay, I'm going to set out to recruit 200 participants, or whatever. I'm going to collect data for a week. What I get is what I get. With qualitative, often people will start a project and they'll just keep going until they think, okay, yeah, I've got this idea formed and it seems like the data is supporting the theory. I get more data, it's still supporting it. Okay, I don't need more data. So you keep getting data until the theory seems stable, right? You aren't getting new data in that don't fit in with the theory. That's the idea of theoretical saturation. The process involved with grounded theory analysis. Once you get your data, which again could be from interviews, focus groups, looking at materials, you get some big pile of data, and you go through and you're going to start coding, right? And that's where you're, say you're looking at a transcript from a movie or an interview or a focus group, what people said, and you're highlighting, you're writing down, and in the margins you start writing down, these words, these codes of, okay, well, when I see this, that's this thing. Right? And what you're doing here, typically for codes, it's not so much you're looking for content, but more often process. So you're using kind of often gerund words to form these codes. So if you're looking at maybe why couples fight, right? You're doing a study looking at that, and you have a bunch of interviews with couples, or maybe you filmed couples just talking to each other, and you're going back and you're looking at the transcripts, and at one point, in one couple, one person says to the other, "You always forget to put out the trash." Okay, so you have a transcript that says you always forget to put out the trash out the side. Maybe you put talking about other. That's a code, right? Because they said you. And then you'll put another code generalizing, because they said always. And you'll put another code talking about chores, because they were talking about taking out the trash, right? So it's at kind of the most basic level possible, just trying to take their words, the data you have, and apply some level of organization to it, some codes. And then you're going to find codes that fit together, right, that are similar, and you organize them into concepts, right? So with the previous example, maybe we had talking about chores, and other couples, that same couple later talked about childcare, and they talked about going to work. So okay, well here's this concept which is we'll say talking about responsibilities. So every time I see that code, I'm now going to label all those codes, because those are all different codes, A, B, C, D. So all those A's, B's, and C's and D's, they're all concept 1. Right? And then again, you keep going. So you do that, you go from codes to concepts to categories, which are broad groups of similar concepts. And then the concepts are used to generate a theory. So the whole time you're doing this, basically you're working from kind of a more concrete, so from finer distinctions to broader, more abstract distinctions, to more abstract understanding of what's going on, right? So we're getting down in the weeds, and then we're slowly pulling that lens back, pulling the focus back to, okay, what do these weeds have in common? Okay, now what does this plot of land have in common with that plot of land? Okay, what does this country have in common with that country? Right, to use kind of a geographic metaphor. Another way to think about the process is I talk about doing open coding and moving to selective coding. Uh, so open coding, you're starting off identifying and grouping codes, kind of like we talked about. So I'm coding this, this, and this, and I'm starting to group them. But at some point, as you're doing that, some core concepts will be identified, right? And this is not that anybody's going to tell you. This is a very kind of intuitive, subjective, fairly artistic thing that happens. You realize, okay, I'm starting to see a key theme here, a core concept, maybe 2 or 3 core concepts. Once that happens, you move from open coding to selective coding. So once you've identified the core concepts, then coding and maybe data collection continues, but only using the core concepts you've identified. The data that don't fit into codes or concepts that you've identified as core concepts are then ignored, right? And this is a process called delimiting, or setting the limits of your theory. This is going to apply to these things because here's the concepts I've identified as core and essential to what I think is going on. Should be noted there are some different versions of grounded theory. It started with Glaser and Strauss, and then they kind of argued with each other and split off. Where Glaser said, "Oh, this is what grounded theory is," and Strauss teamed up with somebody else, Corbin, and they said, "No, no, no, this is what it is." Which fairly different views of it. And then even later on, Sharmaz came along and said, "Oh no, here's what it is." So if you try to read about grounded theory analysis, it may be somewhat confusing because you have to kind of trace the philosophical tree back to, well, what type of grounded theory are you talking about? But the information I've provided here is fairly general enough that it should apply to all those different versions. But just know that there are disagreements in the field about exactly what it is and exactly how to do it and what its ultimate purpose is. Okay, and then an approach that often gets confused with grounded theory analysis or grounded theory method is content analysis. Right? And grounded theory is really a broader approach to doing research, to the point that especially Glaser would say, as you're doing this, you're reading transcripts, anything you read, see, hear, you hear a news report on TV, that can influence the formation of your theory. That's part of your research. That's part of grounded theory. Even though it wasn't part of an interview or focus group, it's just something else in the ether that you attended to. It's the idea that all is data. Right? Whereas content analysis is more about, okay, however you got some data, how can you make sense of the content? So looking less at process, more of what's there, what was said. Typically, it's often about communication. So in content analysis, you're coding content. So similar in some ways to the process of grounded theory, where you start off looking at a transcript and you start just coding. Okay, they said this, they said this, they said this. Okay, those go together, these go together, and again, you can kind of work upward to broader categories. But again, they're more often categories of content and not so much about process. And partly because of that, sometimes people use computer-assisted processes. There's software out there that can do some content analysis, which basically goes through just kind of a word count, where you identify certain words to look for, or it can look for commonly occurring words. The quality of what you get from that really varies on the sophistication of the software, right? Because if you are looking at how happy people are, and or how sad people are, so the computer's gonna go through, and every time it sees sad, blue, depressed, down, it gives that person a point for sadness, and it adds up the total number of points. Well, what happens if the person says, I really wasn't sad at all today? Or they say, my favorite color is blue. Well, they may still get a point for sadness if the software isn't sophisticated enough to determine context, which unless you have some very nice software, the sophistication is going to be fairly limited. But it's a starting point. Last thing about content analysis, it's often used to make inferences about the characteristics of what's said. So looking to simply describe, okay, when couples fight, they talk about this, this, and this. Right? And also to identify antecedents and consequences. So when couples fight, there's this kind of point where they blow up at each other. Before it happens, here are the topics that come up. After the fight happens, here's what's talked about next. Right? But again, those things aren't emerging out of any kind of statistical software package telling you that. That's you making inferences from patterns that you believe you see. Okay. In terms of other methods, there's this is not even all of them. There are dozens of different methods, some of which, if you look real closely, some things look to be the same thing pretty much with a slightly different name, but certainly lots of different terms, lots of different names for things in qualitative research. And I don't expect you to know all of these. I just want you to be aware that there's a lot out there. There's a great deal of variety in terms of qualitative methods. If it's something you're really interested in, you need to take probably a whole other class on it. In terms of validity in qualitative research, they don't talk so much about internal, external, or even construct validity. What they talk about is trustworthiness. In terms of the aspects of trustworthiness, look at things like credibility, which depends on the researcher's ability to demonstrate that a true picture of the phenomenon under scrutiny is being presented. Right. So if I say my study is showing how how young women talk to their parents about unplanned pregnancy, well, I have to be able to show via some process, some evidence that that's what I'm really doing. Which in some ways credibility is like maybe construct validity, with maybe things we're familiar with. So what we're showing is truly representative of this phenomenon. Right? Transferability has to do with our ability, or the researcher's ability, to provide sufficient detail of the context of the fieldwork of the research for the reader to be able to decide whether or not kind of the environment, what was studied, is similar to another situation, so that the findings can be applied to some other setting. So really this is just another way of saying for us external validity, or more specifically generalizability. Right? So if I studied this group of um, displaced immigrants in Houston and found out about their acculturation process, how generalizable is that to other immigrants in Houston, other immigrants from that same ethnic background, other immigrants in other cities of different ethnic backgrounds. Right? So I need to provide enough context of what it is, who these people are, so that people can not necessarily just like say, hey, it is generalizable, but just enough information that someone can decide if it is generalizable, which is, I think, an interesting difference in the approach that quantitative researchers usually do. Typically in quantitative research, we say, hey, we need to make this generalizable. With qualitative, they say, we need to make it transparent how generalizable, how transferable it is. Right? Our goal isn't necessarily for ultimate transferability. We just want you to be able to decide for yourself. So we're going to give you as much information as possible, which I kind of like. Dependability is where researchers strive to enable future investigators to be able to repeat the study. So again, this has to do with reliability of findings, and as we talk about in quantitative research, writing a very clear method section for the possibility of replication. So replicability might be the way we'd say it. Confirmability, being able to demonstrate that the findings emerge from the data and not from the researcher's own predispositions. So this is really the true one, that what we found is really what was there and not some stuff we made up, which is more or less analogous to, I'd say, internal validity, be closest to that. So how do they do this? How do they establish the trustworthiness of their findings of their projects? Lots of different ways. I'll just talk about three briefly here. One of the most common being triangulation, and this is using different methods that result in the same conclusion. So maybe they'll do observation, and then they'll do some content analysis, or maybe they'll do grounded theory analysis to use the data generated by observation to come up with some theory. And then separate from that, they say, okay, here's what we think we found. We'll pretend like we know nothing. We'll go and do focus groups, or we'll have a separate set of researchers go and do focus groups, looking at the same problem, the same question, and see if they come up with the same theory. And if you get the same theory from these two different approaches, then that's thought to be evidence of trustworthiness. Another common approach is negative case analysis. And this is simply analyzing cases or instances that ultimately don't fit with the theory that emerges. Right? And often what they do is they'll go back and look at the data and say, okay, overall this emerged. There's always some exception, right? There's always some person, some incident that doesn't quite fit with the theory. And then they don't make them fit. What they do is they discuss why it might not fit, which may have to do with the person in the instance, or it may have to do with limitations of the theory. Right? They're going to kind of address that. And the last one, which is also pretty common, would be doing member checks. So, and this can range from it's kind of straightforward as if you've interviewed someone, you've transcribed the interview, you go back and you show them the transcript and say, okay, is this what you remember saying? Does this seem to represent your words? Right? That's one way to do a member check. The next level of that is at the end of the project, when you've some theory has emerged. Here's my explanation for what's going on and why it's going on. You show that to a participant, right, and say, does this make sense to you? Does this jibe with your sense of the world and what's going on? Right? And that's another way to study, to kind of establish validity or trustworthiness in qualitative research. Sampling in qualitative research can be kind of different, so go ahead and touch on that just, briefly. Three typical approaches. Purposive sampling being one, and that's where groups of participants are selected according to pre-selected criteria that are relevant to a particular research question. So maybe you're interested in, HIV positive women living in large metropolitan areas. Okay, so you're going to purposely go out and get those women. You're not going to do a random sample of everybody. You just want those people, right? And how many people you get, the sample size may or may not be fixed. So you may say, I'll get 200. You may say, we'll see how much time and resources we have to get it. Or you could go with that idea of, well, we're gonna get as many people as we need to until we've got a theory. That idea of theory saturation, right? So basically, you're looking for you have some set criteria for inclusion in your study, and you can go get people that meet those criteria. Similar to that would be quota sampling, and this is you decide how many people with particular characteristics to include as participants. So you have a set number or proportion of types of participants. So if you say, geez, I want to look at this phenomenon, and I want to be able to talk about how men are different than women in this phenomenon. So I'm going to say I'm going to get equal numbers of men and women. That would be quota sampling. And so if you set a particular number, I'm going to get 50 men and 50 women, or I'll get 50% men, 50% women. Or maybe I'll say, I really want my group to be representative of this population of immigrants in Houston. So I'm going to go see what the census data say about 4 new immigrants to Houston. How many are from different regions, and then I'll use that to set the quotas or the proportions that I'm going to want for my study. And the last one would be snowball sampling, which is interesting. It's where participants with whom contact has already been made. So you find participants somehow. You then use their social networks to refer the researcher to other people who could potentially participate. So you basically say, hey, thank you so much for participating. You're an HIV positive woman in a metropolitan area. Do you know any other HIV positive women in this city or in another large city? So you're using them to get more participants. Right? Which obviously, if you come from kind of a quantitative world, like, whoa, that's problematic. You're going to have people who know each other, and the data are going to be related, and it's not independent observation. But for qualitative research, it's not as much of a problem, again, because you're not going to be using inferential statistics. And of course, you would acknowledge that you use snowball sampling, and so your sample may be unique if they're all somehow connected to each other. But one reason you might do that is if you're trying to work with a population that can be hard to find, kind of a hidden population. So if you're going to go into Russia and try to do a study looking at LGBT youth, it's going to be hard to find them because they're going to be afraid to identify themselves. But if you can find one person, often there's a community of people, and they may be able to, if they trust you, they may then refer you to somebody else in the community, and on and on and on. And that's the snowball sampling approach. Okay. In terms of limitations of qualitative research, obviously there's potentially a high level of inference involved depending on exactly what you do with the data. But there's certainly a lot more wiggle room for a level of inference with qualitative data than quantitative data, right? You're looking at these codes and you're deciding what the next concept and category is, right? There's no numbers to tell you what it is. It's up to your own, and if you're collaborating, you and your collaborators thinking, intuition about that to decide that. So clearly there's the potential for researcher bias, right? Because the whole idea, the philosophy behind it is you go in with no preconceived notions. Now, those of you who are in counselor preparation programs are probably already aware that you really can't go into a situation without preconceived notions. Right? We talk about doing value-free counseling, but ultimately, where it's important, although it's important not to impose your values on someone, you can't strip them from yourself. You can't strip yourself from your expectations. So when people are approaching data and starting to code it, most people will be hard-pressed to say that they really have no expectations about how the data are going to come together. They're going to be looking for at least some type of pattern already before they see the data, even though that's kind of opposite of what the philosophy says you should be doing. Of course, there's going to be questions about generalizability, partly because qualitative research is often done with small groups. And again, it's done with small groups because a lot of data is generated, right? In the article you read, talked about what a 1 hour interview typically generates 10,000 words of a transcript. That's a lot of data to deal with for one person, 1 hour. So often you're dealing with small groups or maybe unique populations, and so generalizability can be a concern. But again, generalizability is somewhat subjective. It depends on to what degree do you believe that your findings should be generalized beyond this group or beyond this setting. In line with the idea that there's a lot of data to deal with, qualitative research can be very time consuming, both in terms of gathering the data, right? Doing interviews, making transcripts takes a lot of time, and then analyzing the big piles of data you get can be very, very time consuming. There's a greater potential impact of the researcher on participants and on data in qualitative than quantitative research. The researcher tends to be closer to the data in qualitative research. And this can be very close, as in participant observation, or even in interviews. The researcher is the one there asking questions, deciding what questions to ask, reacting to the person, right? You can't really, unless you're a very talented interviewer, you're not going to be able to control completely your facial expressions when they tell you certain things. And how you react will then affect them. So what they're giving you isn't pure data. It's data influenced, at least in part, by your presence. Right? There tends to be a lack of standardization in qualitative research. There are lots of disagreements in the field of qualitative research regarding exactly how qualitative data should be analyzed. Right? So we talked about in quantitative research, there's lots of rules, and there's some disagreement about the rules, but by and large, people agree, okay, this is how an experiment is done, this is a correlational study, this is matched pairs, this is this thing. In qualitative, because it's a bit looser, there tend to be more disagreements in terms of how to do things and how things should be done. And finally, some ethical concerns that may be unique or even maybe just more common to qualitative research. It's often done, with marginalized populations, people who are at risk, and so there can be concerns about confidentiality, right? Related to you've got the depth of data you're getting. You're doing these interviews, and people sometimes bearing their souls. You're not just asking these Likert type items. You're asking an open-ended question, and who knows what they're going to give you? They could be disclosing all kinds of very personal things, and so it's important to be able to protect them and their the confidentiality. But again, as researchers, we have to be able to make our data available to other researchers to analyze. Otherwise, people could just make stuff up. So the transcript that you have from this person, you can't keep that secret. You can take their name off of it, right? But somebody else could hear their story again. And if it's in a very personal moment said to you, does that person, even though you will get consent before you get it, do they really understand in that moment that what they're telling you, somebody else could be reading, in some university office in Wyoming? And there is, unfortunately, the potential that even their confidentiality could be breached. There's a case, I think it was some of those East Coast schools, probably Harvard. Researchers working with doing qualitative research, getting interviews, people involved with the IRA, right, Irish Republican Army, Sinn Féin, those types of things, people involved in what some would term terroristic activities. And they said, oh, we'll guarantee your anonymity, we're going to scrub your names from the interviews. Did all these interviews, and the government said, oh, really, you talked to people? Great. We'd love to see those tapes. And they said, no, we gave them promises of anonymity. It's confidential. You're not a researcher. We won't release the tapes to you. And the judge said, yes, you will. And so they did. So there are limits, apparently, to the confidentiality we can guarantee people. Also, another ethical concern maybe unique to qualitative research would be the use of deception. If you're doing participant observation, or if you're going to go into AA and act like somebody that has a problem with addiction or dependence, and you don't, that's deceptive and ethically questionable. So again, that level of researcher involvement, if you're going to use deception to get that involvement, certainly some ethical concerns that need to be addressed to justify doing that. That being said, consideration of all these limitations, qualitative research can look at questions that quantitative research may not be able to, and it certainly can look at them in ways that quantitative research can't do. So I do think we do need both. But the last thing I'll say is, in general, I see this kind of being a process of research where qualitative is something you want more on the front end, right, where you're exploring. And then once you've got an idea, if you've got a theory, then we're going to bring in quantitative. And if there's an existing theory that hasn't been disproved that applies to a situation, well, don't waste your time with qualitative. Go ahead and do quantitative and see if that theory can be confirmed. If not, maybe now we need to go back and do qualitative to see if there's some new theory that needs to emerge. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.